Antifa is anti-gay. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and before I actually present the evidence I have that Antifa is fairly clearly anti-gay, even though they won't really come right out and say it, in a similar way to how Ilhan Omar doesn't admit she hates the Jews, I need to first clarify what I mean when I say gay. Mainly, I'm referring to gay men, though to be honest, they don't seem to necessarily be super fond of lesbians all that much either, because of course, Antifas hate literally everybody besides other Antifas, which means that you can find the stray Carlos Maza, and certainly a fair amount of lesbians who ally with or are full-blown members of Antifa, but gay men are by no means the norm. That said, when Andy No was beat up, you probably noticed that Antifas didn't skip a beat even though it was a crime against an intersectional minority that is both homosexual and the son of Vietnamese immigrants. Most conservatives and sane people of all varieties probably thought that this was unusual for the far left, as they immediately victim blamed him without even mentioning the fact that they beat up one of the very identities they claimed to be fighting for. Thus, I'm sure a bunch of people toyed with the possibility that Antifa might not have a very high opinion of Asians and gay men, but didn't conclude a great deal. However, this is something I've been thinking about for a very long time, due to actually knowing several far leftists and having probably over a dozen former friends who have fallen victim to the misinformation combined with the social manipulation and intimidation that the cult leaders utilize in order to recruit new members, and I've certainly communicated with plenty online since the 2016 election. You see, while I don't want to rehash this too much, longtime viewers of my videos are more than aware that I've made a huge point to speak about how much the left has done a 180 regarding their once positive feelings about the gay male community into how they feel now, where they clearly hate us. In fact, I would argue that they hate gay white men even more than straight white men. Anecdotally, I've noticed a massive amount of hostility from not just the social justice and feminist left, who basically only write stories about gay men that revolve around how racist, misogynistic, and transphobic we all allegedly are, but if you ever talk to one of them and you dare mention, "Hey, I'm a gay guy, I don't like fascists, I'd be targeted by fascists too," they'll use that as a Kafkaesque way to claim that your very mention of that must prove that you are a fascist or a fascist sympathizer or something, as if being stupid enough to claim that gay men can't be fascists is hard evidence that you probably are one. For a long while, I wondered where all of this was coming from, but then eventually I decided to do a simple DuckDuckGo search for it, and it turns out there's been numerous articles written very specifically about how gay men and fascism supposedly go hand in hand. So the mystery of how the hard left turned overtly anti-gay seems fairly thoroughly solved. Fortunately, I have been noticing that more and more gay men, including even the occasional gay church lady, starting to finally get it through their heads that the thought leaders of the left at least never have anything nice to say about our demographic, as the leaders of the far left don't even pretend to offer us anything besides healthcare for HIV-positive men and promises of vexing the supposed common enemy of patriarchy, which literally just means male leadership and masculinity.
Listen up, queens, because if you suck dick and you're mean to girls, this one's for you. Making out with boys doesn't mean you're immune to being a tool of the patriarchy, or just a tool.
That said, since Antifa wants a communist, totalitarian, intersectional feminist state and will stop at nothing to get there, apparently including murder if they can succeed at it, which they tend not to be able to do, I think now is the time that gay men should be aware of how distinct these patterns are, and that if anything, will be targeted more and more as time goes on. Let's begin. The first thing to keep in mind is obviously history, and how communists have traditionally viewed gay men, and I believe will always view gay men. In fact, I think that this will likely only get worse, now that the current leadership in the communist movement is so inseparably tied to feminism. If you had to really think hard about which ideologies there are that frown upon male homosexuality, most people would probably say Islam and Christianity, and occasionally communism. However, while Christianity definitely has a very large anti-gay component within a certain sub-ideology or two or three, unlike Islam, the religion as a whole has always allowed itself to change and reform as time goes on. However, in the Islamic faith, there is no New Testament at all, and the biggest sin one can commit under the religion is attempting to reform the religion, so that's pretty much settled. Regardless, while we all have met gay and gay-supporting Christians, and if not, countless people whose mantra tends to be, love the sinner, hate the sin, we all know that the far left tends to be a lot more keen on the types who seem to believe we should criminalize or kill these filthy infidels, some of whom appear to be holding positions in our government and seem entirely okay with acts of domestic terrorism.
Will you condemn the Antifa attack in Washington over the weekend? It's easy to condemn terrorism. Will you condemn it?
Is it weird?
Antifa firebombed a facility in Tacoma over the weekend. It's an ICE facility. Will you condemn them for that?
While not a great deal of domestic leftists are Islamists themselves, they certainly have no problem showing support for them, because, of course, they are intersectional feminists, which really is rooted in communism, while being centered around post-World War II feminism, which is basically Marxism with a female head. As you can learn about in my video, Intersectional Feminism is Communist Particle Board. Really, you don't need to be a history buff to be aware that communists have traditionally not approved of male homosexuality, as leaders like Fidel Castro believed that male homosexuality was a sign of bourgeois capitalism. This is what prompted Harry Hay, who is somewhat inaccurately credited with coining the gay subculture of the radical fairies, to split off from the Communist Party, and I think the reasoning communists have a problem with gay men is fairly simple. Gay men tend to be rather libertarian regarding the way they navigate the world, as the general mantra of gay men naturally lends itself to mainly self-preservation. While most gay men do not raise families and devote all of their time and energy to keeping their female partners happy or raising their non-existent children to be good, productive members of the utopian society communists have in mind. Being that gay men tend not to have families to worry about, when a communist regime comes into power and there are endless conflict and economic hardships in the region, there is no great way to control gay men, as they don't fear for the well-being of their families that they wish to protect and provide for, because again, those families tend not to exist. This already should dissuade gay men away from the communist ideology by itself, which makes it very odd that the occasional Carlos Maza even exists, though, let's face it, he's not the sharpest saber in the armory. Still, all of this becomes amplified almost exponentially once feminism gets introduced into the equation, because while most gay men have no idea about this, the feminist ideology has an almost pathological commitment regarding their negative view towards gay men.
So this is a really great question, and one that is very much in the news. You've probably seen stories about the actress Rose McGowan speaking on Bret Easton Ellis's podcast and saying that gay men are more misogynistic than straight men. And you may have also seen sort of controversy over the singer Azealia Banks trying to redefine the word faggot to mean essentially misogynist, someone who hates women.
Although that clip I just showed is kind of a shallow example, I have discussed in several videos that male homosexuality's very existence is proof positive that the entire feminist worldview does not reflect reality, as feminism's core belief is that all men collude either consciously or unconsciously to oppress all women, to privilege all males. This came from both the original definition of feminism, which is that The extension of women's rights is the basic principle of all social progress, mixed with the Marxist version of feminism, pioneered by the Communist Manifesto's co-author Frederick Engels from his book The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which basically argued that marriage is a state-sanctioned form of sex and labor slavery in which men keep their wives as baby-making maids or something. To the thinking person, especially any heterosexual man with self-respect, this line of thinking has no basis in reality, as the demonstrable and instinctive primary goal of men throughout all of human history has been to serve and protect women, so that the sex that carries the burden of 9 months of pregnancy and childbirth can survive to procreate the species. However, the idea that gay men view women as objects that they wish to maybe rape or sexually assault, control, and exploit is the most obviously delusional notion that could possibly exist, which is why I legitimately pity any gay man that somehow ascribes to the full scope of the feminist ideology and am forced to assume they only do so because they are using it as a self-serving mechanism to explain away their failures in life, usually regarding their inability to attract sexual partners because they are very feminine, and or their inability to compete with other men.
I mean, that's a difficult question because, like, how is me, who is, to some extent, like, I am a victim of masculinity in a way because of the aggressions that I put up with on a day-to-day basis. Why is it that, like, us? Why is it, like, queer, trans, non-binary people? Why is it us who's got to come up with the theories to be eloquent enough to be able to say, this is how we disable toxic masculinity? Actually, this has got to come from within. Men have got to acknowledge their privilege, and I want them to hand over power, and also I want them to hand over some platform. I'm really up for, like, trying a matriarchy. We've done patriarchy for a long time. Hasn't really worked. Okay, Michael.
Regardless, the point of that primer in history of the Communist Party, feminism, and the brief mention of religion is that there's no possible way to find a conglomerate of individuals and ideologies that hates gay men even more than a bunch of feminist communists with both sympathies and often direct ties to Islam. But that's precisely what Antifa is. So unless you think I made all of that up, this really should be a no-brainer. Regardless, once upon a time the far left actually supported gay men, due to the fact that the gay male community served as a vessel to highlight their supposedly altruistic nature back in the 80s and 90s, when the AIDS crisis was crippling the homosexual male demographic so much that free healthcare, free housing, and free food actually did seem to make sense to many or most gay men. During the 80s and 90s, gay men suffered more clearly and tangibly than any other demographic in the developed world, and because of that, after ignoring the AIDS crisis for a few years, the feminist left realized they could both make money and advocate for socialized medicine together by pointing to the disease-ridden communities of gay men they had acquired as a philanthropic project, after Marxist lesbians had spent the 1970s demonizing gay men and writing atrociously offensive literature about them. Sure, ultimately the Marxist lesbians felt that gay men were horrible, perverted creatures that did things like enact fantasies of raping women when they had anal sex with each other, which you can read about in this book, and they seem to believe that gay men are only gay because they hate women, which I assume was just projection that stemmed from political lesbianism, who were a population that literally declared themselves homosexual due to their hatred of men. Still, they tried to help gay men get handouts from the government and raised money that they often kept for themselves and got credit for it, which is how the GLBT formed, which promptly turned into the LGBT. However, after decades of Democratic Party-backed organizations collecting donations to help out the overall community, an effective treatment for HIV became available, and gay men finally needed less and less philanthropic help. Finally, towards the middle of this decade, gay marriage became nationally legal, and thus, there was no longer a final frontier for the advancement of gay rights to fight over. And while the HIV industry still exists in cities like San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles, the greater LGBT had to find a new calling, or callings, complete with a dozen or so new letters in the alphabet soup. Mainly, the community realized just how much money was truly in the transgender movement, as it turns out that there's a huge demand for trans people to find group meetings and counseling, and also there were all sorts of legal battles such people could choose to fight, regarding bathrooms, pronoun enforcement, and even attempts to label parents who won't give their young children hormone replacement therapy as abusive like they've done in Canada. And here's the thing about the transgender activist movement. Not only was advocating for the time and resources necessary to make these people happy or happy-ish incredibly lucrative if you were an organization that was getting sizable donations to host transgender support group meetings, organize protests, and monthly slam poetry open mics, but more importantly, it was already a perfect fit into the feminist communist worldview, as they believed in the abolition of gender roles entirely. You see, it's hard to know which came first, the supply of trans people or the demand for their rights, funding, and social privileges. However, judging by the fact that this movement basically didn't exist, minus a minuscule fraction of what it is now prior to 2014, we can assume that this was something that largely had to be stimulated by the ideologues who already believed that gender should be abolished. Well, at least cisgender masculinity. Regardless, if I've said it once, I've said it 500 times on my channel. When far leftists say things like that they support the LGBT or the LGBTQIA++, they basically just mean the T. And if you need any evidence about Antifa's feelings, just do a search for LGBT Antifa flags and paraphernalia. As you can see, it's mostly variations of the trans flag, a small amount of rainbow flags, which is everybody, and the only one that says anything about homophobia is from some other country. I assume someplace where gays are very commonly persecuted by the conservatives of the region. Ultimately, trans people are quite easy to rally, because, well, their life is hard, and things will never be all that great for trans people, as surgeries are expensive, most still never pass as the opposite biological gender all that much, and hormones, or the lack of hormones, come with a lot of complications. Thus, trans people that aren't properly vetted before transition often end up entirely unaware of just how difficult things are going to be for them, and when they are hit with it, they end up taking out a lot of their frustrations on both everybody around them as well as the state. And Antifa commonly preys upon the people that are already in such an angry state of mind, not just trans people, but basically anybody. That said, gay men become a target of trans activists for several reasons. For example, there's a lot of gay men who see right through the trans-trender BS, or gay men mention that there was a period where they wished they were a woman to make their lives easier, but decided to own their own maleness. We also don't like people trying to convince us to have sex with vaginas. Lesbians don't like it with penises either, especially when the trans people in question don't even go on hormones. Gay men also tend to be completely fine with being called she or her, so the whole pronoun demand thing often annoys many gay men, because unlike basically every trans activist, we actually have a really thick skin. And leftists generally can't stand minorities who aren't easily offended. That all being said, I think it's fairly clear why there's so few gay male Antifas, and why Antifa supporters are so openly hostile towards gay men. Once upon a time, when the subject of Trump came up early into his presidency, when I would encounter these types of people, they would tell me things like, "You're gonna be rounded up and put into camps too, you know." At this point, likely because none of our citizens are being rounded up and put into camps, Trump has been very open about pro-gay policies and even HIV-related healthcare, and there's a ton of gay Trump supporters that aren't hard to find, I never hear anything like that anymore. Instead, it seems like Antifas almost presume gay men to be fascists or fascist sympathizers until they prove themselves to be deranged, wackos who prioritize transgender activism ahead of their own issues, which there's a lot of, to be honest, and thus, the Antifas don't skip a beat when it comes to their aggressive tendencies that target basically anybody who they feel like targeting that day, including gay men. The idea that more gay men don't seem to realize this is honestly extremely depressing to me, similar to the way that most gay men seem to be legitimately fine with bending the knee to transgender activism, and feminists that aren't the least bit shy about how little they respect us. Most gay church ladies sit around all day saying the same crap about how the squad deserves our full and unquestioned support as the Antifas do, and social justice hipster gays legitimately seem to also assume that AOC must be cool, as if they've never actually seen a clip of her saying whatever dumbass and downright dangerous thing she said that week. And even when they do, they're generally so uninformed that they don't see a problem. Regardless, if even one of these guys watches this video and starts to think about things differently, comment, I can send you more information, and I will be happy. Because now that my channel is demonetized and finding my videos is about as easy as finding a right-winger at the Burning Man festival, that's about the best I can hope for. If you like this video and feel it could help somebody you know, please share it around because I assure you nobody is going to randomly find it. Also, consider donating some money to me on PayPal, Subscribestar, or Patreon, and definitely follow me on Minds and BitChute. Have a good day.